we're very strong on building partnerships. And we don't care who those partners are. We just care at the fact that they think on our same level and they want to do the same thing for the region. Big push up in the Miramichi area now is that when the forestry sector used to be so big, now it's barely nothing up there. There's aspects right from Doketown all the way down to Lamech, where we want that. We want to stop that slowly demise of the forestry industry in our region. So there's a plan being put together to address that. And of course, we have to be self-sustaining within a reasonable period of time. You cannot build or expect to build any type of business or any type of sustainable system and not become self-sustaining, because you can't keep going back to the so-called government trough, right? Or you can't keep going back and get a larger allocation because you can't make what you have work. You got to make what you have work. And so that's one of the reasons why oh, wrong way. I'm usually used to a clicker. I was at this one presentation when she never had no clicker. She goes, just tap me on, I'll hit the button for you. So. But anyways, even with the status quo, like, and we get an increased allocation, it still leaves Aboriginal foresters as contractors. Like right now, we have a few First Nation people within our communities that have a processor, that do go out there and run their own blocks and flag their own blocks off, and they do, manage their allocation. We have other communities that are just not too small. So they contract out to the various mills or the various contractors, and they harvest the wood for them. What's returned back to the First Nation is the royalties or the stumpage that's associated with those particular products, whatever mill they go through. The only thing about that is that some of the First Nations, they came to me and crediting it to the First Nation allocation. So all the First Nations got back in royalties was the value of pulpwood, not the value of the full tree. But that's how industry was cheating that particular First Nation community. Mind you, Irvin's not cutting their allocation no more. And their stumpage increased threefold, because they were taking the stumpage value of saw logs, stumpage value of veneer, stumpage value of studwood, and so on and so on. So when you try to build, equal partnerships with industry, they still try to mess it up for you by giving you the low end value all the time. And of course, in these type of incidents, the costs and more than revenue generated will always different with First Nations funds, because with somebody with a small allocation, you can't go out and buy a machine. We have to look at a different approach. So part of the strategic plan, like I said, is take this allocation, put it all together. Then, for those First Nation contractors that have survived in today's atmosphere, give them the first option to either bid or harvest the full allocation for those particular First Nations. And then turn around and say that those, because the allocation is larger, you can actually invest in more equipment that you need. And you can actually train and build a capacity for First Nation members to build, to operate the type of mechanism you set up. And there's a lot of contractors out there who are non-Indigenous right now that are willing to partner with First Nations to achieve that. And it's just got to get the mechanism and the thing up to do it. Because it's very frustrating for First Nations. Like when I drive here from Frederick to Miramichi, and you look at the amount of forestry contractors just along the main road from here. There's 4 or 5 machines here, 6 or 7 harvesters there, 10 harvesters there, another one there. And it's astonishing that individuals, non-Indigenous person, can build that type of business because they get the allocation to harvest. Why can't a First Nation person be allowed to do the same thing? Why are we left out of that picture? And a lot of those, like I talked to a lot of the harvesters, and of course, they got their big break by, number one, being able to get interest-free loans, or being able to be, first carried by industry for so many years and let go. Mind you, there's some problems with being carried by certain industries because after they carry you for so long, they try to knock you down. And I talked to a lot of people who went down certain road there, and all of a sudden they're running into tax problem and property tax problem because the company that they're working for just ain't giving them enough to survive. So they're stuck with machine payments and all that stuff because all of a sudden industry kept them, you know, at the higher level in the so-called high-end cutting ranges of some of the blocks out there, and all of a sudden they seen them getting too far ahead, they knock them down. I hear a lot of that out there by a lot of non-Indigenous young young men and women trying to get in the forestry industry because the industry still wants to maintain that profit line for shareholders. They don't care about the individual out there in the machine, even though they try to say what they can get their shareholders. You know, that's the bottom line. If they're not as profitable in maintaining that same level of profit year after year, they're going to cut somewhere. We see it in the bank system every year. Like, you know, it's very frustrating to me when all of a sudden you see quarterly reports. There's 450 layoffs coming in the Bank of Montreal this year because their profit was only $450 million this quarter compared to $485 last quarter. There's $1 billion almost made there. But they're laying off 450 people because they were $15 million shorted in the last quarter. You know, you see that all the time in financial reports, that how quick they hit the little grassroots people because their shareholders ain't maintaining that level of profit or growing. As soon as they drop, just the slightest hint that they're dropping, they're going to lay off people. The industry is no different. You see one particular company, with respect to the increase in allocation, back in 2014, the new forest management meeting, they got 600,000 increase in allocation. The promise was to create more jobs. Hasn't created one new job yet. What he has done, he makes the announcements, oh, we're creating 7,500 new jobs this year. And if you look, half of his people retiring, they're just refilling those or promoting them. And then the other ones are moving up the ladder. And the third one is bringing in outsourcing from other countries rather than dealing with your own people in your own country. You really look into the depths of it. There's a lot of things. There's supposed to be a new mill going up in Doketown because of this increase in allocation. Not happening. And we're what, five years into that new arrangement? One big thing there for like our First Nations is working together. Working together not only with First Nations but with everybody. First Nations ain't going to be successful if we don't partnership off. But in light of partnershiping, what we have to do is also develop the structures where we gain more ownership as we move forward. That we have to do it for our communities, because if we don't, our communities are starving. 80% unemployment rates in our First Nation communities. Most of the jobs in the First Nations are government jobs through the Department of Indian Affairs with respect to limiting the amount of funding that comes from government in order to manage the First Nation. The structures on First Nations are related to the Indian Act, which are totally government controlled. The chief and council, even though we give recognition to our chiefs as chief is an English word. You know, we were originally called, and the word Mi'kmaq, in the Mi'kmaq Army, people don't realize, are English and French words. We are Lennu. That's who we are as a people, Lennu. Mi'kmaq came up, and Mi'kmaq came up because of the first treaty signed with the French. The French coined the word Mi'kmaq with the Mi'kmaq people because the word means land of the Allies. Because that first treaty was signed with the French. And that's what it means, land of the Allies. 3:40 p.m. Is that a clue for me?
No, not at all. That was for yesterday.
Of course, some of the advantages also, of course, is opportunities for contracted harvesting jobs outside of current Crown allocations. What's unique about some of this is that when the First Nation Forestry Program had, there was another program called the Aboriginal Skill Employment Partnership Program. And this was where First Nations raised, this was mostly First Nations, raised $5 million a year to train First Nation people to place them with the industry. So they would get the experience, be it a millwright, trucker, operator, welder, whatever. so they can be placed with industry. Industry would not participate. So you wonder why First Nations, you don't have, my father was a Boilermaker. My father was a high steel worker. He built, you know, it sounds funny, he was part of building the nuclear power station. He was a foreman down there. And he was foreman of building the missile silos in Maine. Kind of funny, but anyways, I never thought my father would build missile silos, nuclear silos in Maine. But here he was, even though he had that training and skills, you hear how the Mohawks and the Micmacs built New York City, all the high scrapers, but try to get a job in Canada? Unbelievable. And yet here we put $5 million in every year for 5 years. That's $25 million reinvested in our people. We trained over 500 people to work with the forestry sector in New Brunswick. And we only had one take, and that was with faucets. All the other industry wouldn't take them. They were red seal journeymen. They were trained as truckers, trained as mechanized harvest operators, trained as rangers, everything, at the ranger school and everything. But such a small handful was picked up by industry here in New Brunswick. Most of them went out west to work in the oil fields. But that's sad. That you could not get a job in your own community. On that note, when I was up here at university, there was when I graduated, there was a class of 31 of us that graduated. I finished 4th on the dean's list. All my classmates got picked up by industry. Guess who didn't? I was the only one not hired out of that whole class. I took a job at Forestry Canada. And I used to go down to REPAP here when REPAP was up and running. And I used to deal with your Joe O'Neills, your Bill McDonalds, all these fellas. And I used to go into the mill. And on their hiring board, it was astonishing back then. This was in the 90s. Right on their, job posting. Indians need not apply. Right on their job posting. I took a picture of that, gave it to Joe O'Neill. Oh, that's not, it's still there? I said, I took this picture a week ago. It's still there, Joe. He'd go down and look at it. Oh, it's just somebody in the mill yard there. But the mere fact that that picture, that was on that bulletin board for that first time I took the picture, right till that following week, showed me that it wasn't going to change. And here, when I opened up my door every morning, the first thing I seen was that big stack. But not one First Nation person was working there. And when UPM, United Paper Mill, came in and bought that mill, I said to them, and at that time, the mill was going down what they called the Canadian Association's certification document, Z808, Z809, criterion indicators. When they started going down that road, all of a sudden you had the one First Nation person working at the sawmill that used to be across Anderson. You had one First Nation person working there because they had to satisfy principle number 3. And as soon as they moved away from going after that certification to the one we hear about all the time, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, SFI, 902 or 14002, that's an American standard of certification because we want to satisfy the American market, so all our fiber will keep going down to the States. That's where that standard came from, SFI. As soon as they took that standard on, I said that mill will be closed in 4 years. It's closed in 3. Start dismantling it. So you're in the sector long enough, you see stuff like this happening. And the big yellow machine here in New Brunswick, he's going to be in for a rude awakening. There's changes coming. And we're actually going down there December 2nd for our first visit since the last time I was down there when Blake Brunson was Chief Forester.